We sailed out of Suva in the spring of 1912 aboard a small trading schooner bound for the outer islands, and what began as a routine run for copra and trade goods turned into a night none of us could account for. Off our hull, something moved, too large for any reef charted on our chronometer and sextant night, and the warnings from islanders and the old logbooks suddenly felt like counsel we had ignored. I set these particulars down because habit had taught me to be exact. Names, stores, instruments, weather. We were a crew of 8. Captain Elias Hart, steady and grey at the temples. His first mate, Jonah Reed, 2 hands, Tom Greeley and Ben Cross, and 3 island labourers, Lotte, Mir and Samu, laden with casks of rum and crates of trade cloth, the hold piled with copra, white as bone and stowed tight. Our chronometer ticked true in its brass case. The sextant lived in its leather box upon the chart table, a compass swung from a peg. We carried spare canvas, wrought iron spikes, a lead line for soundings, and a reefing plan written on oilcloth for sudden squalls. It was meant to be a familiar, simple delivery. We cleared harbour at dawn with the bustle of Suva behind us. Sampans cutting water, schooners at anchor, the smell of fish smoke and coconut oil drifting off the wharves. The harbour pilot tipped his hat and bade us keep good easting. Captain Hart set a course toward the eastern archipelago by compass and Admiralty chart. At noon, we took sun sights with the sextant and checked the chronometer. Our reckoning promised a run of near 60 nautical miles before the next post. The schooner rode light under 2 headsails and a main, the canvas taut and singing. Men tended the rigging in the heat. We lashed spare canvas to the booms, set the wrought iron spikes in the locker, and spoke of squalls as a thing of practice rather than dread. There was a small comfort in the routine. Soundings taken upon the lead, logs punctually written, the rope smell of hemp and tar about the deckhouse. The island labourers who had fished these waters with more patience than we carried spoke in halting English and with few words. "Mind the dark water," Lotte said one evening while mending a net, his fingers swift and sure. "There are places where the moon forgets." We laughed as men do to keep themselves from listening too closely, yet Captain Hart had his logbooks, volumes kept since before he took to our little command. In a margin of a volume dated 1889, there was a penciled note, subaqueous swell, sound oft. No flourish, no tale, only practical counsel. After we found that penciled warning, we sounded more often, laying the lead line until its weight became the rhythm of our watch. By dusk, we checked stores once more. Oil for the lamp trimmed, the reefing plan folded into Jonah Reed's chest, the anchors readied though the run was to be an open water passage. The wind eased to a cool easterly, and the sea grew a black sheet under a thin moon. I sat on the lee rail with the sextant case on my knees, feeling the schooners pitch through my boots and the thread of salt in the air. At first, it was only a whisper against timber, too soft for a breaker, too close for a current. Then a pressure, like the bruise of a hand along the hull, made the planks speak in their old language. Tom and Ben straightened. Jonah paused with the oil lamp in his hand. We listened. Off our hull, something moved again, deliberate and immense enough to unsettle the water in a way that no reef on our chart could explain. The lead line lay by the stern, and the penciled note in Hart's log came back to me like an admonition. We were 8 men, checked, provisioned, and precise in our instruments. And yet, as the dark closed in, we had no counsel but the islanders' words and the thin ink of an old margin. a routine trading run. The sea turned glassy on clear nights, and on our second evening, the air was thick with heat and the phosphorescence of the troughs. Seabirds circled low and refused to settle, and the island men muttered of places at sea kept tapu by their elders. We ran soundings with the lead line and found depths the charts did not promise, while an offshore swell crept up the hull in a rhythm that set our hands uneasy and our compass needle trembling in ways I had not seen aboard a trading schooner. We had left Apia with the rising of the moon, and a chronometer set against the ship's clock our papers recorded the date, July 1912, because such things matter when one must answer for losses. The schooner was a two-masted trader, canvas patched in places with cloth from the last port, the booms slick with tar, the deck planks steamed and sweating under our boots. By evening, the sparking of the troughs made the water look as if fish had spilled lantern oil beneath the surface. The lead brought up nothing but smooth black mud that did not smell of the sea. As I knew it, it smelled faintly of iron and something older, like damp rope kept for years in a chest. By habit, I took a sight with the sextant before dusk, then compared the reading to the chronometer. The island boatmen stood aft with their own small torch, faces half in shadow. One, Tui, whose hands knew the reef as he knew the palm of his own, kept tugging at the line of his tapa-cloth and would not meet my eye. He had said once, earlier, in a voice as dry as our rope locker, that there were shoals the maps never named and depths that ate anchors. I had smiled then, and chalked it to superstition at sea. One is obliged to smile at a superstition and to keep a hand near the binnacle lamp. The compass began its queer workings after midnight. I had always trusted the binnacle needle. I had set a course by it more than once after storms. This time, the needle was restless, wavered, stuttered, then slid off its accustomed mark by a full dozen degrees each time the swell struck the hull. The helmsman swore softly and checked the binnacle oil. I went below and tapped each section of the keel. The planking answered normally beneath my palm, but at the stern there was a dull sound, not of wood, but of something that shifted and settled under pressure, like sand behind a curtain. I sent a boy with a lantern to run the sounding again, while I unlashed the boat hooks. When the lead came up the second time, it wore on its cup a string of pale matter, neither weed nor feather, some mucilage of the sea that clung to the leather handhold. The cook took it from the boy and frowned. None of our specimens matched it. It smelled faintly of copper and of the smoked fish we salted on deck. I wrapped it in oilcloth and stowed it beneath the chart table, because men have long kept curiosities there to prove the telling true. At dawn, the birds that had hung like ragged flags overnight began to vanish inland. No one raised sails to follow. No one sang. Instead, the island men hauled from below a small wooden figure, carved and painted, and the older among them set it where the main sheet passed through the blocks, muttering as if tracing an old line of prayer. I did not interfere. We are a rough company and a superstitious one in our own ways, and the sea has taught even the unbelieving to keep counsel. That day the swell increased, though the horizon promised no wind. We heaved to and checked the rigging from the masthead down. Our tarpaulins were secure, the halyards spliced, and yet the hull bore along its starboard side a series of long, faint abrasions, as if something broad and rubbery had slid and left its trace. They were not new wounds. They were more like the scars of something large that had brushed the planks and passed. I ran my hand across them and came away with the taste of salt and the same faint iron tang as the stuff on the lead. In the afternoon, while I was noting the bearings in the log, there came a sound from the water. At first, a low vibration beneath our boots, then a series of thumps, each one spaced as though something vast and patient was testing our keel. The men clustered along the rail, coin eyes grown small with fatigue and caution. Old Manu, who had sailed these waters before the charts were drawn, fumbled in his bag and laid out a handful of shell money, which he placed on the capstan with a deliberate, trembling hand. He would not speak of the Tapu shoal by name. Instead, he kept glancing seaward and sometimes lowering his head to touch the deck. We took a hawser and let it run clear off our stern, more as a measure of calm than with any belief it would bind us to safety. The sea answered by pushing the ship in slow, circular breathing that did not fit the wind on the face of the water. At dusk, the lanterns along the cabin were snuffed not by decree, but by a shared silence. No man slept. I wrote this with one eye on the binnacle and the other on the dark line where water met night, for the swell had become hands, gradual, cold, moving up and under, and something below left a wake that made our brass rails sing with a frequency I did not know a schooner could carry. We did not speak of turning back. To do so would be to admit that the roots our fathers taught us had teeth. We trimmed sails, stowed extra spars, readied the small boat and its oars, and kept the charts under the lamp as if mere ink could aid us. When the stars emerged, they seemed, to my tired eye, to drift in a latitude mismeasured. I made a final note in the log before sleep took me. A careful sentence on compass error, a record of the Leeds haul, the strange matter folded in oilcloth below deck. Then a thud against the hull, soft at first, then nearer, woke every man and left us on our feet, breathless, listening to the dark as if it might answer. At dawn, we found fresh scrapes along the garboard strake below the waterline, and lengths of frayed hemp, our spare mooring line, smeared with something that glimmered like oil. The lantern on the starboard rail had its glass cracked, as though struck from beneath. We noted drag marks on the rudder. The lead line had snagged on nothing and paid out with a sudden jolt, and the wrecked blubber hook we used for splicing showed dents and a score of parallel grooves no human hand had made. The light was a flat grey that blurred the horizon and made the sea into a sheet of pewter. Salt stung at my lips, and the tide lay sluggish against the hull. Captain Monroe came up from below, pipe between his teeth, and ran a palm where the garboard was bruised. His fingers came away slick with that oily film. He cursed softly, more with the tone of a man who found his charts askew than of one surprised. We took to our routine. The leader stood on the rail and sent the brass, wrapped in tallow and marked every fathom, down to sound the bottom. It fell 2 fathoms and then jerked as though gripped by something. The line paid away and the lead came up with nothing but a thin smear of residue and some torn stringy weed. No rope, no netting, no stone, nothing a seaman would call a snag. The carpenter's chest was opened irons and mallet was set out, oakum and pitch readied for caulking. I examined the blubber hook. It was a simple implement for splicing and cutting. Now the shank lay bent, the fluke dented. Along the head ran even grooves, like the spacing of a saw. Mr. Daniels, our boatswain, crouched and felt them with a furlowed thumb. "Like teeth," he said, and there was no mistaking the plainness of it. There were sounds we could not make sense of. From beneath the timbers came a rasping, a long scraping that rose and fell with the motion of the sea, setting the stays to a low, uneasy vibration. The gulls paid us no mind. The island where we meant to trade showed as a dark thumb of land on the skyline, and its palms did not stir. We ran a fresh rope through the chocks, lashed the spare mooring where she could not be taken again, and caulked the garboard with oakum and hot tar. Such work steadied the crew. The smell of pitch is a remedy for a man at sea. As evening drew down, the men kept watch, in turns, eyes to the water and hands on the rail. I slept little. When night closed, something came along the hull with a force that made the lantern on the starboard rail shiver and crack, exactly as we had first found it. And from the water rose a long, low moan that set my arms to gooseflesh. No man would lift a light to stare into the black. We huddled instead in the cabin for tea and the small comfort of routine. At first light, we weighed anchor and pulled clear of the island, every spar and sail lashed and the crew at their stations. Captain Munro kept his hand near the binnacle and asked the compass for steady bearing. The blubber hook lay lashed to the rail, its grooves bared, and we left it there by tacit agreement. None of the crew spoke of chasing whatever had nudged and tested our timbers. We chose the safer craft of seamanship and open water. Still, the rudder bore its drag marks for days, and the lead brought up that same thin smear. At night, I stood by the lee rail and listened for the rasping beneath the timbers. The scrapes on the garboard, the frayed hemp, the cracked lantern, and the hooked tools scored as if by teeth showed a presence had examined our hull and then left us. That knowledge rode with us. One night, with only a hand at the binnacle and the quarter lantern dimmed, we heard a sound like a far-off wind pressed against the timbers, and then a great thump as the schooner shuddered. A shape rose beside us, a dark mass wider than our beam, undulating in slow, deliberate rolls, skin glistening with the sea, and a row of pale reflections along its side that caught the lantern light. The movement heaved our cargo and bent the stanchions. The men clutched the rigging while the captain ordered the helm, but the creature held alongside as if testing our hull and exhaling a pressure that made every loose nail ache. We wore oilskins and our mouths tasted salt and lamp oil. The mate, Ruiz, fetched the sounding line while Jim Toll lashed himself to a shroud. The compass in the binnacle quivered, the brass chronometer on the chart table ticked as if for another tide. Captain Elias Crowther gave plain orders. Back the foresail, ease fore braces, get the yawl clear, ready rockets. We let canvas luff hand by hand until the schooner yawed and the thing kept pace. Its flank passed like a dark moon against our planking. By the quarter lantern, I saw those pale reflections set at intervals, neither scale nor whalehide, flat and hard as plating. Every breath it drew sucked at the tarred seams jars in the forward locker sang on their lashings. A coil of hemp broke free and struck the companionway. Then, with a shove, one stanchion bent and a case of salted pork went over. Tins chimed as they sank. The shove left a smear along the planking, viscous and smelling of iron and rack. I scraped at it with my knife. It clung like varnish to the grain. Tools could not reach the thing. After that, it slid aft. Not a hurried departure, but a slow unmooring, the pale lights lengthening into a ribbon that sank beyond the stern. The sea closed. and the night resumed ordinary sounds, swells lapping and rigging creaking. At first light, we bore for Suva, our rigging lashed, stanchions battened, sails stitched at the leeches. Crowther entered in the log that the vessel had had a heavy body alongside and put into harbour with damage. Officials questioned us. We gave the list of losses and paid for temporary repair. There were no useful answers. Jim left the service the next month. Ruiz kept watch but fell into morning prayer. I took a scrap of that smear in a bottle of spirits, corked and pitch-sealed, and kept it with my papers. It dried to a varnished membrane. A doctor in Suva called it organic detritus and would not sign more. Sailors traded stories, and island folk muttered of reef things beyond charted measure. We patched and paid and sailed again, but the memory clung. I waked with the taste of that pressure and the image of pale reflections aligned and watching. The log rests on my shelf, the inked page of that night left uncorrected, an open question between date and place. Captain Crowther never smoked his pipe after that watch, and he rubbed a white scar at the base of his thumb when the night wind came off the beam. The shipyard riveted extra bands along the whale and tarred the seams. The owner lodged an insurance claim, and an adjuster from Auckland noted only swell damage. Islanders we met afterward would not sail that lee. They spat and muttered of reef warnings and things that moved without light. Men who had been with us steered clear thereafter. I kept the bottle and the log and carried them like a superstition. In later voyages, I altered our track to avoid that stretch, and the schooner received iron bands. The memory sat beneath the skin like pressure. I woke with the taste of it in my mouth, and the image of pale reflections aligned and watching. We limped into the nearest trading post with planks lashed and sail mended, the schooner riding lower by the stern than when we had left. It was March of 1912. The chronometer had slipped 2 minutes to the slow. The sextant had been wiped with salt and grease until the horizon blurred in the glass, and the binnacle lamp guttered when the last bottle of oil was poured into the wick. Our cargo manifests were damp from spray, and the captain's log had a new entry in a hurried hand, ink blotched where a thumb had pressed too hard, and that page was folded and sealed between invoices as if the ledger itself could keep counsel. One hand never came on deck again. The thing had come alongside in a weather that held neither gale nor calm. A long grey hour when wind and sea kept the schooner on a slow, even heave, and the sky hung like an untrimmed sail. We first noticed it by noise. No animal I had known, but a low grinding that ran along the timbers as if a millstone had been set to drift with us. It began as a scuff beneath the waterline, a pressure against the keel that made the plank sing with a tone not unlike a half-remembered bell. I sent the mate to the bow to loose a spare fender. The man, Jonah Priors, was a steady hand who had measured the tides of Tuvalu and Samoa, who checked the lead line 3 times in a watch and could trim canvas blindfolded. He was the one to look over the side. He leaned on the bulwark with the rope coiling at his feet, night oil on his gloves, lamp in the jackstaff throwing a thin cone of light into the black. What we saw beneath the lamp was not that of any whale, not of a shark, and not of a ship's wake. The water parted in a slow, deliberate swell and revealed not flesh in any way our charts could name, but a length of ridged surface, dark and glistening, like iron scaled in kelp. It bore rows of barnacle-tufted ridges the size of small casks, and when the schooner shuddered under its flank, there was a smell, iron and old seaweed, and the faint sweetness of brine pounded on copper. Jonah reached, as men will do when a thing is nearest and curiosity overrules caution. He put his hand on the rail, and then, as if in answer, something rose alongside and touched the wood where he stood. The touch was not the push of a creature eager to flee, but the deliberate testing of an instrument. The fender swung between hull and that ridge, the rope hissed as the thing shifted, and then there was a single sound I shall never forget, part suction, part tearing of canvas, and Jonah was gone. He took no scream with him, for there was little time. 1 second, his lamp threw the light of his face on the water. The next, the light burned across nothing, and only the fender swung, flaring salt and a smear of something like dark oil on the rail. We lashed the helm, cut the main sheet, and ran every line we had. Stevens, the captain, boxy and methodical by nature, barked orders with a voice made small by shock, and for a span no man, except for a worked set of motions, hand to block, eye to halyard, was present. We hauled Jonah's chest-high belaying pin, searched the sea with lanterns until our arms ached and the night ate their beams. The creature cooperated only to the extent that it kept pace. Sometimes we felt it at the stern, a heavy pressure that made the copper fastenings groan. Sometimes it slid away, and the water closed with a sound like cloth snapping. No trace of Jonah was found, only his glove, snagged on a shroud and spattered with a brown that flamed against the white of the deck. When at last we put into the trading post, a cluster of lean houses with woven mats drying on racks and a pier of ironwood black with use. The islanders walked the decks as if they were reading the schooner's bones. They touched our planks with practiced hands and spat once, a gesture of long memory. We told them plainly what had occurred, and they listened with the gravity of those who read the ocean like scripture. We signed the manifest, paid the repairer for tar and oakum, and took a carpenter's opinion on our ribs. He said the timbers would hold but never be the same. He kept his tools face down when he worked. Years after, whenever a merchant spoke of the sea and the ports where we frequented, our names would travel like a rumour, whispered with the clink of glasses. The schooner's timbers bore the scars for all who cared to look. A gouge beneath the counter, a row of barnacled marks along the port side, the faded blotch where Jonah's lamp had fallen. We altered our routes, took heavier watch below, and kept lead lines at hand in a degree of superstition that was, in truth, practical. Charts from that season carried a penciled warning by the latitude where we had met the creature. Some chart makers crossed it out, others refused to mark the place at all. I wrote the account into the log, a direct record dated and signed, and then folded it into the manifests because paper alone was a kind of ballast. To this day, the question of what could ride alongside a trading vessel and test a hull as if reading the planks remains an unanswered mark on every chart I trusted. The sea keeps her counsel, and the gap Jonah left in our crew is a quiet ledger that no man has yet balanced.